Welcome to Parisburg First United Methodist Church. You know, in churches we joke about you can't sit right here because that's where Jane sits, because everybody seems to have their assigned seat. Now, why do you sit in the same place every single time? It's because you experience the Lord Jesus Christ right there. Maybe it was last week, maybe it was last year, maybe it was as a child, but at some point in your life you came to worship, and in that moment, while you were in that place, the Lord spoke to you. Place is important. 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 1 through 14 talk about place, about where we were when we were running for our lives and God was there. Where we were when we were going through the normal activities of the day, doing what the Lord directed us to do, and the Lord was there. Doing what we were supposed to do in times of great change, and the Lord was there. Every single time we've come to the same place because we've realized the Lord is active and present. Today we're going to a flower shop because for a lot of folks on Valentine's Day, that's where love is active and present. Thanks for joining us here today. Tell us your name first off. You're?
Becky Croy, Pearl's Petals. We named it after my grandmother. Her name was Pearl Fields. She just passed away last January.
Oh my goodness.
103 years old.
Wow, 103. So I hate to interrupt you. This has got to be your busiest week all year. How long have you been doing this now then?
Since 2013.
And what made you start doing flowers then?
I'm a blooming idiot.
Okay.
We just thought there was a need for it in the community. There used to be two other flower shops. One was here, then they had one in Parisburg, and when my husband and I opened this one, the one in Parisburg had closed and this one had closed. So it just left one for the county, which was in Narra.
And by the way, we're here partially because one of your employees, Christy Miller,
She's also my aunt.
She also comes to part of our worship services. So what's the most popular flower for Valentine's Day?
Oh, roses.
Roses, okay.
Red
roses, huh? All right, if I'm a cheap husband, what's my best flower to give?
Well, roses.
Roses?
You can't be a cheap.
You can't be a cheap husband?
Not on Valentine's Day.
I can't be a cheap husband on Valentine's Day.
No.
Okay, Becky, so what's your favorite flower? I mean, you've seen a lot of flowers.
Oh, probably hydrangeas and Gerber daisies. The hydrangeas, they're big. Mm-hmm. You don't find a lot of naturally blue-colored flowers, and you can get the hydrangea in like a powder blue. And Gerbers, I like everything about Gerbers. There's so many different varieties and colors.
When the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on their way to Gilgal. Elijah said to Elijah, "Stay here, for the Lord has sent me to Bethel." And Elijah said, "As surely as the Lord lives, and as you live, I will not leave you." So they went down to Bethel. The company of the prophets of Bethel came and said to Elijah, "Do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today?" "Yes, I know," Elijah replied. "Be quiet." And then Elijah said to him, "Stay here, Elijah. The Lord has sent me to Jericho." And he replied, "As surely as the Lord lives, and as you live, I will not leave you." So they went to Jericho. The company of the prophets of Jericho went up to Elijah and asked him, "Do you know the Lord is going to take your master from you today?" "Yes, I know," he replied, "and be quiet." And then Elijah said to him, "Stay here. The Lord has sent me to Jordan." And he replied, "As surely as the Lord lives, and as surely as you live, I will not leave you." So the two of them walked on. 50 men from the company of the prophets went and stood at a distance, facing the place where Elijah and Elisha had stopped the Jordan. Jordan took his cloak, rolled it up, struck the water with it. The water divided to the right and the left, and the two of them crossed over on dry ground. And when they had crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, "Tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken from you?" "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit," Elijah says. "You have asked a difficult thing," Elijah said. "Yet if you see me when I am taken from you, it will be yours. Otherwise, it will not." As they were walking along, and talking together, suddenly a chariot of fire and the horses of fire from heaven appeared and separated the two of them. And Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind. Elijah saw and cried out, my Father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel. And Elijah saw him no more. Then he took hold of his garments and tore it in two. Elijah then picked up Elijah's cloak and had fallen from him and went back and stood at the bank of the Jordan. He took the cloak that had fallen from Elijah and struck the water with it. Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah, he asked. When he struck the water, it divided to the right and the left, and he crossed over. Elijah and Elisha, two prophets, very confusing because they have almost similar names. But let's begin to talk about them. And I want to talk about them because they talk about places. And I want you to think about places right now. It talks about how they went from Gilgal to Bethel, and Bethel to Jericho, and then Jericho back to the Jordan River. Those are important places in the life of Israel. Bethel is where the people of Israel, that's where they remembered the power of God who works. It's a story that goes back there to Jacob, when Jacob saw the angels ascending and descending as he slept that night there on a stone rock. It's a story that goes on throughout the history of Israel, for they know that is the house of the Lord, and they is a holy place for them, and that's a place where they remember that when you're running for your life, just like Jacob was, God is still right there. They travel, as you recall, from Bethel to Jericho. Jericho is this massive city, but we remember in the history of Israel, Jericho was the city where the Israelites experienced a major miracle of God. You recall they were told to do ordinary things and expect extraordinary results. They were told to march around the city for 7 days and do nothing. And on the seventh day, they were supposed to march around 7 times and blow the horns and shout for the Lord. And the walls of the town came tumbling down. Think about that right now. Is there a time in your life when you're doing the ordinary things and you wonder, Lord, are you still working? Lord, do you still care about what's going on about me right here, right now? And guess what? God says, I do care. In those ordinary acts, when you're marching around Jericho, God is still working. And then Elijah and Elisha traveled to one more place, the Jordan River. Actually, it started the Jordan River because Gilgal is historically the place where the Israelites crossed the Jordan River the first time. And now we're back at the Jordan River again. This marked the boundary of the Promised Land. It marked that point where Joshua took over from Moses. For Moses dies on the side of the river, and then Joshua goes to the river, and the ark goes. They put their feet in the river, and the waters pile up, and the Israelites travel across on dry land. And now Elijah takes his coat, his cloak, his mantle, and hits it against the water. And the waters part. And Elijah and Elisha walk through on dry land. You see, as they travel from place to place, they're recalling the history of God, a God who says, I'm even there in the midst of change. I am there. Today, I'd like you to watch a short video. A video of couples in our church who talk about their first place or their first date. And think about what all has happened because of that first date and the place they went. And think about the places you've been. And think about, Lord, was there a time in my life that I was running and you were there? Was there a time in my life, Lord, when I was in the midst of change and you were there? Lord, was there a time I'm just doing the ordinary things and you were there?
Lance and Grace went to a movie, had an outdoor walk, and got a hamburger from a hamburger joint. Nick and Jackie, movie. Curtis and Mary drove to Mary's house for first date home visit No Going Out to Dinner in 1960, Tracy and Troy, Red Lobster and a Movie, Teresa and Granville, Lord Hardwicke's in Charlottesville and to a Movie, Jim and Rhonda, To the Alabama Symphony, Andy and Mary Ellen, Trip to the Mall and the Pet Store, Bobby and Patty, Girlfriend's House for Dinner, Jim and Jean, Baseball Game in Wise County, Billy and Marguerite, Homecoming Dance, and Lindy's Restaurant in Blacksburg and Bowling, Jonathan and Mary Ellen, Virginia Tech football game in November of 2006, Jerry and Rita, Tasty Freeze, Tim and Trish, the opening night of Jaws at the Boonesboro Theater and a Supreme Pizza at the Pizza Inn, Harold and Ann, Lakeside Amusement Park, they skipped school, Brian and Barbara, a movie to a local restaurant called Barn Hills Ice Cream Parlor for tacos and ice cream sundaes, Eric and Leslie, McAdoo's, Eddie and Louise, Johnny's Kenny's Drive-In, Steve and Debbie, Sadie Hawkins dance at our high school, our senior year in high school, Mary Ellen and Bill, playing tennis, Wes and Amy, a dance at Virginia Commonwealth University during the first week of school, Mark and Diane, it was Thursday night pub where college kids hung out, Nancy and Mark, drive in and got a hot dog, Mike and Diane, the town park to throw softball and play on the playground, Wes and Stephanie, we drove through the mountains and up to the fire tower, Alan and Debbie, movie at the River Oaks Theater followed by pizza at a local place, Jason and Kim, Wilford House Dinner Theater in Wytheville, Scott and Emily, Kabuki and the Drive-In, Cliff and Shelby, a Sunday drive through Carroll and Wythe County, Jim and Betty, Queens.
We have a God who plans the future. This story of Elijah and Elijah, first off, talks about places. It's also an important story about who is going to take over. Is Elijah going to become the prophet that Elijah was? Will he become the prophet that leads the country of Israel from this point forward? And you recall that Elijah says, "What do you want?" And Elijah says, "I'd like to have a double portion of your spirit." Elijah says, "I can't grant that, but if you see me when I go up into heaven, you shall receive that portion." Now let's take a second here and talk about double portion, because there's two meanings for that. The first one is the one I've always thought of as a literal meaning, that Elijah wanted twice as much prophetic power as Elijah had. Now, think about that for a second. Do you really want that? Elijah gets a lot of trouble as a prophet. People hate him. He runs off in the wilderness at one point because he feels like he's all alone and no one's speaking to him. There's nobody left that loves God. The king himself wants him dead. The queen wants him dead. Do you really want to be twice that prophet? Yet we do know. As you count the miracles, just count the miracles, obviously the biblical writers did believe literally that Elijah had twice the power of Elijah. Because Elijah, the one who takes over, does twice as many miracles, literally, as Elijah is recorded of doing. Now, the other way to interpret this goes back to how the Israelites calculated who became the successor for the family. What happened was the oldest child got the double portion, and the rest of the children got to divide the last portion. It was all about inheritance. And the one who got the double portion was signified, this is the one who's going to take over. The double portion says, I'm saying you are the one who's going to be the new leader. You are the one who's going to take my place. Elijah goes up in the whirlwind, and all that's left of him is a mantle, a cloak, an outer garment. It's all that's left. Now, perhaps you have relatives and you have some keepsakes from them. of what's left from them. Often it's not very much, is it? It's just a few sacred things that say, this reminds me of my grandmother, my great-grandmother, my great-grandfather. And you have this special item that says this is who they were. And Elijah is left with this mantle. And you recall, as I just said a few minutes ago, he takes that same mantle and he goes to the Jordan River and he strikes the river with it. And asks that question, where's the God of Elijah? And at that moment, the river parts. And Elijah walks through, and it's clear to him, it's clear to all who see it, that he is the successor. He is the one who's taking over for Elijah. I ask you now, who's taking over for you? Who have you taken over for in the past? In times of change, when things get up and down, can you remember that our God still plans out things? Can we remember that our God plans things and is in the process of planning new challenges for us and saying, I'm here preparing the way for you, preparing the way for my people. Because if there was one thing about Elijah that was different than Elijah, it's Elijah, this great prophet of God. He preached a strict doctrine without much grace. But Elijah, who says God saves, which is very similar to our own Josiah, which is similar to Jesus, who saves. Many of his miracles are filled with grace and mercy, remind us the power of God not only to punish and to declare that there's a right and a wrong, but there's also a promise to say, I forgive and I give hope. Now, I want you to think about that for a second. As I jump back here to a movie from 2004, it's actually based on a 1996 book by Nicholas Sparks, The Notebook. Now, if you were not a teenager in 2004, you may not remember this movie, but it was a top teenage movie. In fact, it got the Best Kiss Award on several different websites that year because it talks about an elderly man, Duke, sitting there in a nursing home. And every day he would pick up a notebook and he would read to a fellow patient a love story. And often he would get to the end of the story and close the book and say, how did you like the story? And one of the times he reads it, the lady to whom he's reading it looks up and says, that's my story. And then she would look at Duke and realize that Duke is her husband. And the story is really about the two of them. And for a moment in time, her dementia would fade. And they would remember together the past they had. It's a powerful story. And today I want to ask you, do you remember the past you have with God? Do you remember that God is still working in you? Do you remember that God still cares about you and loves you? You see, we have a God who cares. And far too often the world creates a dimension inside of us that we forget. We forget what God has done before us. We forget that God could do even more with us and that God is still with us now. Let's walk together some more and see what else God has planned. You've already heard that God is a God who acts. God is a God who plans the future. But I also want to remind you that God intermingles with us. That's what I need you to remind yourself of right now. You see, when Elijah dies, he doesn't die like we expect normal people to die. Elijah is taken up in a whirlwind straight into heaven. But it's not just a whirlwind. There's chariots of God and his horses of fire that come and separate Elijah and Elijah and separate the two of them so that Elijah cannot go any further. God steps in and says, it's time for the two of you to become separate. It's time for Elijah to finish his race. It's intriguing to me that we skip forward to the 13th chapter of 2 Kings. And once again, this same phrase jumps out and it reminds us that this same phrase is used to describe Elijah himself when a great king of Israel comes to him who believes deeply in God and realizes that Elijah himself is dying. and realizes that God is still intermingling here in this world. I share that with you to remind you that God does work with us right here and right now. You probably know Elijah from the New Testament. When John the Baptist comes, many say, isn't Elijah supposed to return first? And Jesus says to him, that was Elijah. He was the great prophet of God who came and spoke to us. We also know that there, the Mount of Transfiguration, when Peter, James, and John went up in the mountain, and there was Jesus, and with him were two people from the Old Testament. Two people, Moses and Elijah. The one who was the great prophet, and the other who was the great lawgiver. The two great people from the Old Testament. Both show up with Jesus, and they talk together, and they remind Peter, James, and John that Jesus is part of this, that God is intermingling right here with us. Today, I want you to remember that God is intermingling in our midst as well. Heaven and earth are not separated when God's around. When God's around, the two become one, and God's around, they become something powerful. I close our service today as we listen to Chris sing for us, The Gift of Love. And as he sings, we watch Becky Croy create a flower display for us, this display. And I ask us to remember, is there a time in which you felt God's present with you? Was it a pew? Was it a church? Was it an altar rail? I want you to ask yourself, was there a time when you realized that God was working in you and you were about to take up the mantle of God and be used in a great way or a small way? Something started. Maybe it was your first date. You had no idea what it was going to turn into. But God did, and God used it. And do you realize that God is still intermingling in your life today? Where would you wish God would work in you right now? It's the gift of love. Amen.